They were all looking at me, and for the first time, it wasn't because I had spoken. It was because the man standing at the front of the room, the same man who had just taken credit for my work, couldn't answer a single question. My boss had been confident just moments earlier. He had stood there, explaining my project like it belonged to him, smiling as the investors nodded along. But now, something had changed. His voice, once steady, had begun to fade. The investors' questions still hung in the air, simple but precise, the kind that didn't allow guessing. For a brief second, he tried to recover. He adjusted his jacket, cleared his throat, and forced a small laugh, as if buying time would somehow bring the answer to him. But it didn't. The silence in the room only grew heavier. Then he turned slightly, his eyes finally landing on me. Amara, maybe you can explain that part. I didn't move immediately. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I understood what that moment meant. The same man who had just reduced me to someone who helped with minor details was now depending on me to save him. As I slowly stood up, I realized something. This wasn't just a question. It was the moment everything began to fall apart. But this story didn't start in that room. Every morning, I walked the same road to work, surrounded by the noise of the city coming to life. Vendors called out to passing customers, the smell of roasted maize filled the air, and motorcycles weaved through traffic like they had somewhere urgent to be. It was loud, chaotic, and full of energy. And in the middle of all that movement, I was just another person passing through. There was a small tea stall near the corner, run by an older man who rarely spoke. He didn't have a sign or a proper setup, just a metal kettle, a few cups, and a quiet presence that most people ignored. But I didn't. Every morning, I stopped there. I bought tea, sometimes even when I shouldn't have, and he would hand it to me with a simple nod. We didn't talk much, but there was something about the way he looked at people, like he noticed things others didn't. One morning, as he handed me my cup, he paused and asked softly, "Do they see you?" I smiled, not thinking too much about it. "Not really," I replied. He nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something for him. At work, it wasn't any different. Meetings came and went, voices filled the room, but mine rarely stayed long enough to matter. Ideas I shared would fade away, only to return later in someone else's voice. Usually, it was my boss. And somehow, when he spoke, everyone listened. But one day, something changed. The problem had been sitting there for weeks, quietly draining the company without anyone fully addressing it. Numbers were slipping, performance was dropping, and every meeting ended the same way, lots of discussion, but no real solution. That afternoon, I decided to speak. I explained a system I had been thinking about, something more structured, more long-term. It wasn't the simplest idea, and it definitely wasn't something you could summarize in one sentence, but I knew it could work. I had already thought through the details, the risks, and the potential outcome. For a brief moment, the room went quiet. Then my boss leaned back in his chair, gave a small, almost amused smile, and said, "Let's not overcomplicate things, Amara." A few people chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was easy to agree with him. And just like that, the moment passed. The conversation moved on, and my idea disappeared as if it had never been said. But I didn't forget it. That night, long after everyone had left, I stayed behind in the office. The building was quiet, the lights dim, and for the first time all day, there were no interruptions. I opened my laptop and began building it on my own. Slowly. Carefully. Step by step. No recognition. No approval. Just belief. Because deep down, I knew something no one else did. This wasn't just an idea. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And someone had already started paying attention. From that night on, my routine changed. I still showed up to work like everyone else. I still sat through meetings, took notes, and listened as the same ideas were repeated over and over again. But once the office emptied and the noise disappeared, that's when my real work began. The building would fall silent. The lights would dim. And for a few hours, it felt like the space finally belonged to me. I worked through every detail of the system, testing, fixing, rebuilding. There were nights when nothing worked, when I stared at the screen wondering if I had been wrong all along. But then there were moments, small breakthroughs that reminded me I was on the right path. Days turned into weeks. And slowly, something began to take shape. No one asked what I was doing. No one noticed I stayed late. Even my boss barely acknowledged me unless he needed something simple handled quickly. But that didn't stop me. Because I wasn't building this for recognition anymore. I was building it because I believed in it. And somewhere deep down, I had a quiet feeling, one day, this would matter. I just didn't know who else was watching. It happened on a normal afternoon. I had left my laptop open while stepping out briefly, something I almost never did. When I returned, my boss was standing near my desk, pretending to check something on his phone. But his eyes, they moved too quickly. For a second, we just looked at each other. Then he smiled, casual, like nothing had happened. "You've been busy," he said, glancing at my screen. I nodded. "Just testing something." He stepped closer, resting his hand lightly on the desk. "This is interesting," he added, scrolling slightly before I could stop him. Something about that moment didn't feel right. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Too curious. Too controlled. Before I could respond, he straightened up and walked away like it didn't matter. But it did. Because for the first time, I realized he had seen something. And whatever he saw, he wasn't going to ignore it. That was the moment everything quietly began to shift. After that day, my boss started paying attention. Not openly. Not in a way others would notice. But I could feel it. He began asking questions, small ones at first. "How's that task going? Still working late? What exactly are you building these days?" They sounded casual. But they weren't. Each question came with a pause, like he was waiting for something more than just an answer. I kept my responses simple. Controlled. Careful. But the more I held back, the more interested he seemed. One evening, as I was packing up, he stopped by my desk again. This time, he didn't pretend. "You know," he said, folding his arms, "you should share more of your work. People won't notice if you keep everything to yourself." I looked at him, unsure whether to agree or not. Then he added, almost too smoothly, "We're a team, Amara." A team. The word didn't sit right. Because if we were a team, why had I been invisible for so long? Still, I nodded. And that was the moment I made a decision I would later regret. I decided to trust him. The next morning, I brought everything. All my notes, all my models, all the pieces I had been building quietly for weeks. I organized them carefully, making sure everything made sense, hoping that this time, things would be different. When I showed him, he didn't interrupt. That alone felt unusual. He listened. Really listened. For the first time, he asked deeper questions, not dismissive ones, but thoughtful ones. He even nodded at certain points, like he finally understood what I had been trying to say all along. By the end, he leaned back in his chair and said, "This is good. Really good." I felt something shift inside me. Relief, maybe even hope. He told me he would review it further and discuss next steps with leadership. He said this could be something big. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe him. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I had in months. But what I didn't realize was this, that wasn't the moment he started supporting me. It was the moment he took everything. And I had just handed it to him myself. At first, nothing seemed different. A day passed. Then 2. Then a week. I waited for feedback, for a meeting, for any sign that the project was moving forward. But nothing came. My emails went unanswered. My messages were acknowledged with short replies that didn't lead anywhere. Still reviewing. Will update soon. Busy schedule. Each response pushed me further into uncertainty. Then I noticed something else. Meetings were happening without me. Rooms I used to be invited into suddenly felt closed. Conversations stopped when I walked in. And whenever I asked about the project, I was told not to worry, that things were being handled. Handled. By who? I already knew the answer. One afternoon, I saw him leaving a conference room with senior management. He was smiling, speaking confidently, holding a file I recognized immediately. My file. He didn't see me standing there. Or maybe he did, and chose not to. Either way, the message was clear. Something had changed. And I was no longer part of it. But I still didn't know how far it had gone. The announcement came the following Monday. Everyone was called into the main conference room. It wasn't unusual, we had meetings all the time, but there was a different energy that morning. People seemed more alert, more curious. My boss stood at the front, confident as always. Then he said it. "We'll be presenting a new strategy to external investors this week." There was a brief pause, just long enough to build anticipation. "It's something I've been developing over the past few weeks." I felt it immediately. A quiet drop in my chest. He continued speaking, outlining the concept, the structure, the vision. Every word sounded familiar. Because I had written it. I sat there, still, listening as he explained my system like it belonged to him. No hesitation. No acknowledgement. Just complete ownership. Someone asked, "Who worked on this with you?" He smiled slightly. A few people assisted here and there. Assisted. That was the word he chose. My name was never mentioned. The room filled with approval, impressed by what they believed was his work. And I sat there, silent. Not because I didn't know the truth, but because I was starting to understand something else. He hadn't just taken my work, he had rewritten my place in it. After the meeting, everything moved quickly. Emails were sent. Plans were finalized. The project was no longer quiet, it was official, structured, and suddenly very important. But somehow, I wasn't part of it. I checked the internal documents. My name wasn't there. Not in the reports. Not in the drafts. Not even in the version history. It was like I had never touched it. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Something technical. Something that could be fixed with a simple message. So I went to his office. He didn't look surprised to see me. "I noticed I'm not listed on the project," I said carefully. He leaned back in his chair, calm. "Amara, you contributed, yes," he replied. "But this needs clear leadership. It can't look scattered." Scattered. I stood there, trying to understand how weeks of work could be reduced to that one word. "I built most of it," I said quietly. He smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "And I refined it," he said. That was his answer. Final. Controlled. I realized then, this wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. And he had no plans of giving it back. 2 days before the investor meeting, I finally received an email. It wasn't what I expected. Instead of assigning me a key role, it placed me on the support team. My job was to handle minor logistics, slides, timing, small adjustments if needed. Nothing strategic. Nothing visible. When I read it, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not shock, just clarity. Later that day, during a rehearsal, my boss introduced the team to a few senior executives. When it was my turn, he gestured casually in my direction and said, "Amara helped with some minor details along the way." Minor details. The words landed quietly, but heavily. No one questioned it. Why would they? That was the version they had been given. I nodded politely, just like I always did. But something had changed. For the first time, I wasn't hoping to be recognized anymore. I was simply observing. Watching everything carefully. Because deep down, I knew this story wasn't finished yet. And something unexpected was about to enter it. The morning of the presentation felt different. The city was quieter than usual, or maybe it was just me noticing things more clearly. As I walked to work, I slowed down near the corner where the tea vendor usually stood. But he wasn't there. The small metal kettle was gone. The cups were gone. The space looked empty. I paused for a moment, scanning the area, as if he might suddenly appear from somewhere. But nothing moved. For some reason, it unsettled me. He had been there every day without fail. And now, just like that, he was gone. I continued walking, but something stayed with me. A question I couldn't explain. When I reached the office, everything was already in motion. People were preparing, adjusting, rehearsing. My boss was at the center of it all. Confident, focused like nothing could go wrong. And maybe that's what made it feel even more strange. Because somewhere inside me, I had a quiet feeling something was about to shift. I just didn't know how big that shift would be. The investor meeting was held in a building I had never entered before. Everything about it felt different. The space was larger. Quieter. More controlled. Even the air felt heavier, like every word spoken inside those walls carried weight. I took my seat toward the side of the room, exactly where I had been placed. Not in front. Not visible. Just close enough to assist if needed. My boss stood at the center, preparing to begin. His posture was perfect. His confidence had returned fully. To anyone watching, he looked like the rightful owner of everything he was about to present. I looked around the room. Executives. Analysts. And then, the investor. He sat calmly, observing, saying nothing. There was something familiar about the way he held himself. Something I couldn't quite place. But before I could think about it further, the presentation began. Slides moved. Words flowed. The room listened. Everything was going exactly as planned. Too perfect, and that's when I understood, moments like this don't fall apart slowly. They change all at once. And it always starts with one question. The presentation had been going smoothly. My boss moved from one slide to the next with practiced confidence, explaining every part of the system as if it had lived in his mind from the beginning. The room followed him easily. Heads nodded. Notes were taken. Then it happened. The investor raised his hand. It wasn't dramatic, but just a small gesture. But it stopped everything. Can you explain how the system adapts when the input variables shift unexpectedly? The question sounded simple. But I knew it wasn't. It went straight to the core of the design, something I had spent days refining, something that required understanding, not memorization. My boss smiled, like he always did when answering questions. Yes, of course, he began. For a moment, he sounded convincing. Then his words started to slow. He repeated parts of what he had already said. Circled around the idea. Avoided the actual logic. The investor didn't interrupt. He just watched. And that silence made everything louder. Because now, everyone could hear it, the difference between knowing and pretending. And for the first time, doubt entered the room. He adjusted his tone, added more words, hoping clarity would come with volume. But it didn't. The more he spoke, the less certain he sounded. A few people shifted in their seats. One executive leaned forward slightly, as if trying to follow the explanation. Another glanced at the slides, then back at him, confused. It was subtle. But it was happening. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was beginning to thin. The investor tilted his head just slightly. Let me be more specific, he said calmly. Then he asked a follow-up. This time, even sharper, even deeper. The kind of question that doesn't leave room for interpretation. My boss paused. Not long, just enough. Because in that pause, everything changed. He looked at the screen. Then at the table. Then briefly, in my direction. And for the first time since the presentation started, he didn't look in control. He looked like someone searching for something he didn't have. The room went quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet. This one felt different. Heavy, expectant. My boss cleared his throat again, but this time the sound echoed more than it should have. He tried to speak, but the words didn't come out the way he wanted. What we did was, he started, then stopped. It wasn't just hesitation anymore. It was exposure. Because now, everyone could see it. He didn't understand the system the way he had claimed to. The investor didn't rush him. Didn't interrupt. He simply waited, and that waiting made the moment impossible to escape. Seconds passed. No one spoke. And then, slowly, my boss exhaled, forced a tight smile, and turned his body slightly towards me. Amara worked on some parts of this, he said carefully. She can expand. The words landed quietly. But they carried everything. Because in that moment, he had just rewritten his own story. Every eye in the room turned. Not partially, not casually, but fully towards me. Just minutes ago, I had been invisible, positioned to the side, introduced as someone who handled minor details. Now, I was the one they were waiting on. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the room settle around me. Not pressure exactly, but attention. Real attention for the first time. I didn't look at my boss. I looked at the investor. Then I began. I explained the system the way it was meant to be explained. Not in fragments, not in rehearsed lines, but in full structure. The logic, the reasoning, the trade-offs behind each decision. I didn't rush, I didn't try to impress, I simply spoke the truth of what I had built. And as I spoke, something changed. People stopped looking confused. They leaned in. The same slides suddenly made sense. The same project felt different. Because now, it was clear. This wasn't just knowledge, it was ownership. By the time I finished, the room was completely still. Not because they were unsure. But because they understood. The investor leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that felt familiar. Too familiar. Then he asked another question. This time, directly to me. Not through my boss. Not as a follow-up to me. I answered again, calmly. Then another question came. And another. Each one deeper than the last. And each time, I answered without hesitation. Not because I had memorized anything, but because I had lived every part of it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my boss still standing, still silent. For the first time, he wasn't leading the room. He was trying to understand it and failing. The shift was complete. But something else was building. Something I couldn't explain yet. Because the way the investor was looking at me, it wasn't just professional interest, it was recognition. The questions stopped. Not because the investor had run out of them, but because he didn't need to ask any more. He studied me for a moment longer, then slowly closed his notebook. "What's your name?" he asked. The room shifted slightly. It was a simple question. But something about the way he asked it made it feel different. "Amara," I replied. He nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. "Amara," he repeated quietly. Then, for the first time since the meeting began, he smiled. Not the polite kind people use in formal settings. A real one. And somehow, it felt familiar. He leaned back slightly in his chair, glancing briefly at my boss before looking at me again. "You explained that better than the presentation itself," he said. No one laughed. No one moved. Because everyone understood what that meant. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a correction. And in that moment, the room stopped seeing me as support. They started seeing me as the source. The investor didn't look at the slides again. Instead, he asked one more question. This one was different. Not about the system as a whole, but about a small detail. Something buried deep in the structure. Something I had added late one night when everything else had failed. "Why did you choose that fallback logic instead of the standard model?" he asked. For a second, I was surprised. No one had ever noticed that part before. Not even my boss. I answered carefully, explaining the limitation, the risk, and the reason I chose a different path. As I spoke, I saw something change in his expression. Not surprise but recognition. Like he had been waiting to hear that exact answer. Then he nodded slowly. "That's what I thought," he said. The words were quiet. But they carried weight. Because now, it wasn't just about who understood the project. It was about who built it. And somehow. He already knew the question was, how? The meeting was no longer about the project. Everyone in the room could feel it. The focus had shifted completely. The investor rested his hands on the table and looked directly at me. "Tell me," he said, "how long have you been working on this?" I paused briefly. "Months," I replied. Mostly after hours. A few people in the room exchanged glances. That was new information. Not part of the official story. The investor nodded again, as if each answer was fitting into something larger. Then he asked something that made everything pause. "Do you still pass by that corner every morning?" For a moment, I didn't understand. Then it hit me. The tea stall. The quiet man. The question. My chest tightened slightly. "Yes," I said slowly. "Or at least, I used to." The investor leaned back, watching me carefully. And in that moment, everything started to connect. But I still wasn't ready for what came next. The room was silent again. But this time, it wasn't tension, it was anticipation. The investor stood up slowly. Not rushed, not dramatic, just certain. He adjusted his jacket, then looked around the room briefly before his eyes returned to me. "I think," he said calmly, "it's time to clarify something." No one spoke, no one interrupted. Because everyone knew this moment mattered. He took a small step forward. And then, "I'm not just here as an investor." A pause. Just enough. Then he continued. "I've been observing this project for a while now." My heart started to race. Not from fear, but from recognition. And then he said the words that changed everything. "We've met before." The room shifted instantly. Every head turned between us. And suddenly, I wasn't just standing in front of an investor. I was standing in front of someone who had been in my life all along. For a moment, no one spoke. The investor's words hung in the air, quiet but undeniable. "We've met before." I felt it before I fully understood it. The way he stood. The calm in his voice. The way he watched people more than he spoke. Then it clicked. The tea stall, the metal kettle, the quiet mornings. My breath caught slightly. "You," I said softly, almost not believing it. He nodded. "Yes." A ripple moved through the room. Confusion, surprise, disbelief. "I wasn't there by accident," he continued. "I wanted to see how people treat others when nothing is at stake, and how they carry themselves when no one is watching." His eyes stayed on mine. "And you," he said gently, "never changed." The room fell even quieter. Because now, this wasn't just about a project, it was about character, about consistency, about truth that doesn't need an audience. And suddenly, everything I thought was invisible had been seen all along. The investor turned slightly, now addressing the room. "This project is exceptional," he said. "But what matters more is the person behind it." No one questioned him. No one interrupted. Because the evidence had already been laid out. He looked back at me. "I'd like to move forward," he continued, "but under one condition." The room leaned in. "That the person who built this leads it." A quiet shock spread across the table. Not loud, not dramatic, but powerful. Because everyone understood what that meant. My boss didn't speak. He couldn't. For the first time since I had known him, he had nothing to say. The control he had held so tightly was gone. Just like that. The investor stepped closer, extending his hand toward me. "Amara," he said, "this is yours." I looked at his hand for a second. Not because I was unsure. But because I realized what it represented. Not just recognition. Not just opportunity. But justice earned. And slowly, I reached forward. And everything changed. A few days later, everything looked different. New meetings. New roles. New expectations. My name was no longer missing. It was at the center of everything. People who once overlooked me now listened. Carefully. But the biggest change wasn't the office. It was me. Because even with everything shifting around me, something inside stayed the same. One morning, I found myself walking the same road again. The noise, the vendors, the smell of roasted maize. Nothing had changed out here. And for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it all. Then I saw him. Not behind the kettle this time, but standing across the street. Watching quietly. The same way he always had. I walked over, holding a cup of tea he handed me without a word. This time, I spoke first. "Why me?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "Because you were the same person," he said, "when it didn't matter." I nodded, understanding now. Because in the end, it was never just about the project. It was about who you are when no one is watching. Kindness, honesty, and quiet effort are never wasted. The right people will see you, even when the world doesn't.